Welcome to Voice Notes to My Best Friend. Today, we will be talking about the power of vulnerability. And
You're really close to the camera. I can't.
is that what you texted me?
Yeah, you're like,
Oh
how you,
I'm really
are you in a jail cell?
there isn't enough oxygen going to my brain.
Guys, I don't understand why my eyes are always open. It's like, dude, if anyone's that close to the camera, your eyes are gonna look huge.
No, there isn't enough oxygen going to my brain today. I genuinely have less oxygen going to my brain right now. Okay, I'm being serious. So if I don't make sense during this podcast, we're just gonna roll with it. Okay. Okay.
Okay, should we just restart? I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Aditi.
I'm Tika.
And I'm Harini, and welcome to what happened there? Trying to say hi, I'm Harini, but instead I went hi.
It was like someone was.
Let's just start. Okay, everybody, center. Okay.
Hi, I'm Aditi.
Hi, I'm Tika.
I'm Harini, and welcome to another episode of Voice Notes to My Best Friend. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about the power of vulnerability. This is a topic that I think all of us have had really different, but also very similar experiences and journeys with throughout our lives. So yeah, we're just excited to share some of those experiences, and yeah, we're curious to see how all of you relate to this topic and what your thoughts are around vulnerability as well. So to start off, I thought there could be maybe if we start off with a question that could kind of center us all on where we want to start, because this is a very broad topic with a lot of incredible points that could come out of it. So I guess the question I wanted to ask you guys is, have you felt like you've always been a vulnerable type of person, or do you think that's a practice that you've had to cultivate over the years? Yeah, so why don't we start with that?
I think that it's definitely a practice I've had to cultivate over the years. I think that it's really interesting. I feel like I meet a lot of people and then all of a sudden, like even a stranger, and they're like spilling their heart to me. Like I don't know what it is, but like I'll just be genuinely like have a lot of people just completely unload. And so I feel like there is like a level of vulnerability that comes with that, where like the other person is displaying vulnerability, right? And like they don't even know that they're doing that. And so I'd say I have more of an experience of like receiving vulnerability from like loved ones and strangers, but actually practicing it, I don't think I have been as intentional of practicing it until I was a little bit older. I just think it was like hard to be transparent in my vulnerability and let people in that way, because I think I was always scared of being judged or rejected. And I've had experiences where I've been judged and rejected. And so then it's like, why would you want to indulge in that again?
Do you, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you feel like it took you a little bit longer? I mean, I think it's great that everyone opens up to you, but I think that's as much of a virtue as it is, because I know I open up to you, Harini does, like, it's also sometimes like a vice at times, because like you almost can't open up to that person. You're like always like being on the listening end, so you can't be on the talking end. So do you feel like because that's been the case, it's been harder for you to be more vulnerable?
I guess like in a sense, right? You don't want to like, I never want to make the other person feel like I'm not listening to them or what they're saying isn't important enough for it to be like the center of the conversation, right? So I guess like in a sense maybe, but I don't think that it's been more difficult for me to practice vulnerability because the other person is being vulnerable. I genuinely just think it's because of how I'm thinking that that person is perceiving me.
Yeah, I mean, I will say Aditi is saying it in the most sweetest way possible, but it is actually very, very true. Like I've witnessed it firsthand. Everybody just like opens up their heart to her. You could have like the most stoic person ever, and Aditi will get something out of them that nobody else can. So I think there's definitely like, I mean, I definitely see that as a virtue. I think that's like an incredible skill and an incredible quality she has. I think it definitely comes from the fact that she's an amazing listener. And I think it's also, she has the ability to really feel the emotions that you're feeling. And I think that's what always makes her feel like such a safe person to open up to. But I really like that point you shared, Aditi, where, you know, it's amazing that you have that quality, but because it's almost like you're able to give that space to other people, but it's hard for you to create that space for yourself. So I kind of want to dig a little bit deeper on why that is. Like, why are we always so ready to like open up, or maybe we think we're so ready to like open up to have other people share for up to us, but we don't necessarily um, feel comfortable to share with them. And I think this also varies on the personality. I think I'm the complete opposite, where I'm a huge oversharer. And sometimes I need to take a step back and be like, wait, I didn't even like ask this person how they're doing or what's going on in their lives. So like I have to like practice a little bit more of that vulnerability in the sense of being a better listener and holding that space for somebody else. But it's interesting because you have the opposite issue where it's like you're so open to receiving that from other people, but it's hard for you to share your vulnerability with others. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I think we're like on both two different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. I think like genuinely it's like a fear of being seen. Like I think that it's a lot easier to come to terms with a situation where something doesn't work out how you want it to, and then you saying like, well, I didn't show that person who I really was, so they're not really rejecting who I am, versus what if you actually show who you are and then that person still rejects that version of you. It's a lot more difficult to grapple with, but I will say that I think it's become a little bit easier to become vulnerable, and it's been easier to dissipate that fear because of me accepting who I am,
Mhm.
right? I think the more I accept myself, the easier it actually is to be vulnerable, which is a really cool concept that I think may go hand in hand, because like then you're not scared of showing who you are, and then you don't really give the power to somebody else to reject who you are, and whatever rejection looks like in your mind, right? Like be it in like a friendship, be it in family, be it in a work environment, be it in a romantic relationship. Like I think the more that you accept yourself, the easier it is to show who you are and not feel like somebody can take that away from you.
Mhm.
But I would say that's a very, very, very recent development in my life.
Love that. I think, and Tika, I'm so curious to hear your thoughts too, but I think for me, being vulnerable has never been a challenge for me. I think I've always felt like I've had to, you know, adapt to the environment that I'm in. So I do think that like my people pleasing extroverted nature will make it so that I try my best to fit in when like whatever group I'm in. And that's a whole other conversation we can have around fitting in and accept like being accepted and loved and all that. But in terms of like being vulnerable, I feel like whenever I felt I was in a safe space or I was with people that I trusted, I always felt that I could open up pretty easily and share what was going on in my life. And it almost became like, well, it still is for me. It's the crux of how I relate to other people. Like, if I can't share with you my deepest, darkest, no, I'm kidding. But if I can't share with you, like, my like how I understand the world, how I feel, how I communicate. For me, it's like I don't really it's like that relationship can only go so far, right? And for me, it's like,
Connection.
right?
Like a form of connection.
Exactly. Like that's how I connect with people. And like for me, the connection will only go so far as how vulnerable we can both be with each other. So like with you two and some of our other like close friends that we have, like because we've cultivated that safe space for each other and been able to be vulnerable and that vulnerability be reciprocated, it almost makes you feel like, okay, like this is the premise of what it means to like have friendships, or this is what the premise of love is, right? Is to be able to have that connection. And that only really comes from being vulnerable with each other. So I don't think I've ever had an issue with being vulnerable. I think it's more finding those safe spaces to be vulnerable in and trusting that the other person understands where you're coming from, is receiving it, and is also reciprocating with their vulnerability. Because sometimes it's like if you're super vulnerable and nobody's really sharing back with you, you're like, okay, I don't know, maybe I just overshared. So yeah, that's been the journey for me in that context.
But I feel like I feel like Harini, you do a really good job of like I think you share your deepest darkest secrets with everyone. And you always say that, but I don't know. I don't think you do. I think you do a very good job of separating, of being vulnerable but not oversharing. And I wanted to ask how you do that because I feel like a lot of the times when you become a little bit more vulnerable with someone, you end up sharing and then sometimes you feel bad because you feel like you overshared. So, yeah, how do you find that balance?
I mean, I honestly didn't even know that I had found that balance. I feel like I overshare a lot, but I don't think it's so much about like censoring what it is that I'm saying. I think it's more about having a circle that I truly, truly trust. Like, you don't have to feel like you have to over commit or overshare who you are to people that you don't feel that close to, or like don't necessarily have your best interests at heart, right? So like why would you go out of your way to overshare to those people? And it's a fine balance because vulnerability is what brings connection, right? So you do want to be vulnerable, but how do you do it in a way that is safe for you too, right? Because it's a lot to put yourself out there, like what Aditi said. And when that doesn't get reciprocated back, it can make you feel really, really hurt because you were your most raw, deep self with that person, right? So I think for me, it's been about cultivating that circle of trust. And like you two are definitely like in that circle of trust. My family, my husband, and a couple of other friends are in that circle of trust. And when I'm in that circle of trust, it doesn't feel like, oh my God, I have to be careful. Like, I can't share this part. I can't share. Like, it just feels like whatever happens here, I know that these people love me, that they've been with me through everything. They understand me better than I understand myself. And I hope they feel the same about me with them. Right. So it just like that safe space allows us to get to that deeper level. But I have coworkers, I have like friends that I'm just starting to get to know, and I don't think I've been 100% vulnerable with them. And maybe I will get to that point. But I think it's like a balance. You have to kind of figure out like, okay, like, do I feel ready to take that next step in that friendship or in that relationship to start sharing those deeper parts of you? Because it's right, like our hearts are so sacred, right? And you want it to be with people that you protect and trust. I don't know if that really answered the question, but just
I
how.
have a couple of things. So I think that I completely agree. Like, it is a lot easier to be vulnerable with the people that you trust the most. But I think maybe like I want to also like dive into another thing of like, how do you begin being vulnerable in the first place? And how do you cultivate that vulnerability in the way that you lead your life? Not just with like your closest people, but with like other members of society. And also, Teeks, I want to know what your relationship to vulnerability is as well.
Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna sound like a psychopath, so bear with me. But I feel like so I it's well, my relationship with vulnerability. I feel like I've always been somebody that's been vulnerable, but I feel like I don't know, it feels like people are always so closed off initially. And so I think seeing that, I also became closed off. And I think with time, I guess like as I got to understand myself and own who I am, I became more vulnerable, and I saw that change in people too. Um, but I think like when I meet new people, how I go about being vulnerable with them, it's like there's parts of me that I haven't fully accepted yet, and then there's parts of me that I know may not be perfect, but I'm okay with it and I've accepted them. And it's both like you're being vulnerable talking about both of those parts. So I feel like when I've accepted myself in a specific way, and it's like something that's pretty deep within, and it's like a more recent revelation, I feel like those are the things that I talk to newer people about. That's why I feel like I sound like a psychopath, because it sounds like some math equation. But I feel like those are the things that I talk to newer people about. But things and parts of myself that I haven't accepted, that I keep super dear to my heart, I feel like I talk to you guys about those things, right? Um, or I keep it within myself. So I feel like that's kind of how I separate and start off my relationship being vulnerable with someone, because I feel like it's really scary initially when you're making a new friend and you're deciding to be vulnerable with them, because like you never know how somebody might use that against you. So I'd like to share things that you can't use against me because I've already accepted it.
Like that's such an interesting approach. I don't think it sounds like a psychopath. I think that's exactly what I was saying too, but you worded it in like such a better way. But it's true, right? Like we always test the waters first, right? With the people that we're meeting. We first start sharing the things that we're comfortable talking about, which is maybe like what we do, like what our hobbies are, what inspires us. But then what are our fears? What are like situations of doubt or loss that we've experienced? Those are like those conversations that we don't necessarily off the bat start off with. So Aditi, to your question, like how do you practice vulnerability? I think it really does need to first start with, and I loved how Tika, you said that there's parts of you that you haven't accepted yet about yourself. So I think first it needs to start with accepting all parts of you, like the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, accepting that. And then finding people that you can be completely vulnerable with, share all of those parts with, and know that it's a judgment free space and they understand and love you no matter what comes out of it. And then slowly, like when you have that inner circle, I think it makes it a little easier because you're like, I have my core group that I know will always be there for me. And now it gives me the confidence to go and try to bring some more people into that circle, but not necessarily feel so much pressure that it has to happen in a certain time frame, or like you have to share everything from the beginning or instantly feel comfortable with that person. Because I think that takes time.
And it's really interesting because there's also so many different types of people, right? And I feel like there are people where if you're vulnerable with them, they may not respond, but then moments later or days or weeks later, they're going to send you a text message and they'll be like, you sharing that one day, it changed my life, or it changed how I perceive something. And I feel like that's happened to all of us. And then there are people that like will literally straight up to your face be like, I don't want this. Like, I don't want to be vulnerable. That's not what I'm about. And then you're like, okay, then I'll meet you where you're at. And that relationship is just going to stay there at that level, because I feel like with us, like we like being vulnerable with other people. We're deep people, and I think when we meet new people, we want that relationship with them. But and so sometimes when that's not there, you're just like, wait, but I want to know everything about you. Like I want to know what goes on within you. Like how does your heart work? But I feel like some people just don't want to share, and then you just have to be okay with that. You just have to be okay with being like, okay, that's where our friendship will be, then that's okay.
Yeah, and I think like that is the power of vulnerability, right? Like I think that when you are brave enough to take that next step of being vulnerable, like you reap the rewards of that, and like those rewards are connecting with yourself more and connecting with others more, maybe creating a community around you that understands you on a deeper level than you have, but I do think it's a really scary process, because like you said, like I think everybody wants to be accepted, but everybody's just too scared to open up to be accepted. And like Harini, you were mentioning like a safe space, so like we're part of the same like a spiritual community, and there are these retreats we go on, and there are like groups you get assigned to where the entire purpose of that group is so that you can have vulnerable discussions of things that matter to you, and I don't think that a lot of people have that avenue, and it's not something you're taught. So it's like, as a young child, you're not taught how to be vulnerable with other people. You're not taught what healthy vulnerability is. And so as adults, you kind of go through life like bumping into one person, like seeing like, does this work, bumping into another person, seeing if this works. And I think a lot of people get discouraged when they feel like the vulnerability doesn't work for them, and I think also like I feel like how women express vulnerability and how men express vulnerability is very different. I feel like nope, first of all, I don't think anyone's taught how to be vulnerable, but it seems like more of a feminine quality. And so I feel like it's more difficult for men to be vulnerable and express themselves and allow themselves to be like received in the way that everyone should be received, I just think it's interesting. I think a lot of people really, really struggle with the concept of it. And I think that if we had more judgment-free zones, like we'd just be like a little bit kinder to each other.
It's so true. And to your point, Aditi, the power of vulnerability, what that does for human connection, how much deeper that relationship can go. We've all experienced that. Like we all started off as surface level friends, right? And then through those conversations, through being more vulnerable with each other, we've gotten to this point now where it literally feels like magic when we're together. And I think it's because we've like cultivated that practice of vulnerability with each other. But, more than like it doing a disservice in your ability to connect with other people, it does a disservice to yourself too. Because if you can't be vulnerable, and I'm not saying that I've like figured it out, I'm like completely vulnerable. I think I still struggle with this as well. But like, if you can't be vulnerable, how are you really working on yourself? Like, how are you taking a hard, deep look into who you are and the parts of you that you actually really do need to work on, but you're not even there yet. Like you can't even be vulnerable and open enough with yourself to say, this is all the stuff that I need to deal with, right? And this is all the stuff that I like I'm not so proud of, but like I really want to work on. If you're not cultivating that vulnerability with other people and sharing and receiving, it becomes so much harder for you to like connect deeper with yourself and that relationship with yourself too. So I think it really does a disservice to yourself as well. If you're not, if you don't have those spaces and if you're not even doing it, for yourself.
100%. And I think to accompany that, just bringing together some of the things that you guys said is like when you're not vulnerable, it's because like you were talking about it, Diti, it's like that whole like being liked aspect of it, right? And it's like I feel like we strive so much to be liked that we end up not being vulnerable in the fear that we won't be liked. But then it's like if you're truly vulnerable, you are going to be liked. And the people that don't like you are going to kind of just like spread away as they should. And then the people who are there to accept you, your safe space, your safe people, they're going to come closer and closer to you. And that isn't that what isn't that what you want?
I feel like I have the perfect example of this with both of you and some of our other friends in college as well. Because, I grew up in a very spiritual background, which meant that there are certain there are just certain experiences that I didn't really feel comfortable partaking in the college culture. And I remember like not feeling comfortable and vulnerable enough to share that those experiences made me uncomfortable, or I didn't really resonate with it. And I didn't really want to do it because I feared that I wouldn't be able to connect with both of you or other people in our sorority or just like other friends that we had. So I hid that part of myself. It's so sad because it was like my values that I was hiding and not being vulnerable about. And what it did was it allowed me to be likable, but it didn't really like form those deeper connections that I was looking for. And then I just got so tired of like playing this double life of like being like one type of person when I was with you guys and another type of person when I was at my with my family or when I was at temple. And I was like, why does it have to be this way? Like, why can't I just share my entire life with these friends that I've made and everything about who I am and just see how it's going to be received? And I just feel like you both so beautifully received it, and some of our other friends in college so beautifully received it. And in the first, like for the first time in my life, I didn't feel this dissonance anymore, that I was leading a double life where I had like my school friends and my temple friends, or like these friends and like this different group, and it had to be broken up like that. Like there is a way to integrate it, and it comes from being vulnerable, and it comes from people that you share that with being able to accept that vulnerability. So shout out to your college selves, guys, because I honestly don't even think we'd be at where we are right now if you didn't let me just receive me for who I was then.
But I think that's what it is, right? It's like a journey, right? Like, and I feel like a lot of the things that you were saying, it also highlights honesty, right? I think that there's a lot of honesty and vulnerability, and I feel like maybe that's why people are scared, because like you have to be honest with yourself, and maybe there are just parts of yourself that you're not willing to look at yet. You're like not willing to face, you're not willing to change, you're not willing to transform yet, and maybe that's the stage of life you're in, which is fine. But I think that there's a lot of honesty and vulnerability, and so it makes it even scarier. And I feel like what you were saying is like that's also like the journey of vulnerability, of like practicing it, right? You started off not being vulnerable and honest about like how you wanted to present yourself, and then you practiced it, and that's why you were able to land on your feet and find people that make you feel safe and make you feel loved. And I think that's another big thing, is like anything that is good requires practice. And so I think vulnerability requires practice as well. And it's scary because it's like the way that you practice vulnerability is usually with other people. And so you're opening yourself up to other people and other people's opinions and other insights. But like, I think everybody at the core knows what works for them and what doesn't, right? Like, I I think like through my journey of vulnerability, I've like become distant with some people that, we don't see eye to eye, but I've also met so many people that like have loved me just for existing because we do see eye to eye. So it's like it's a very tricky and scary process, but I just think it leaves you feeling better. And I also think that like even if you're left alone in your practice of vulnerability, like it won't always be like that. I think that it can feel like a very isolating experience when you are trying to be vulnerable with people that don't want to receive it, but that doesn't mean that that's how it's always going to be. So,
And then you also go into it with, like, you don't go into it with the intention that that person also has to be vulnerable too. You're like, I'm sharing to share. Don't share if you don't want to, right? One thing you said about honesty reminded me of It's so true. I feel like sometimes when you're not ready to be vulnerable, it's because you're not ready to be honest with yourself. And that reminds me of this talk that we all had a couple of years ago at the retreat that you were talking about. And at the talk, I remember a couple of years ago, it's so crazy because it's like you're expected to like get married to someone and like be in a relationship, but then you like shouldn't want a relationship because it won't happen. And I feel like I had such a weird relationship with wanting a relationship that I couldn't even talk about it without crying. And I remember I like talked to you guys about it and I like literally ugly cried, ew. But I literally talked to you about it and I finally let out what had been in my heart for like years probably. And I think, I'm gonna start crying. But I'm gonna start crying because not because of like because I can't talk about it, but because of what it did for me. Because it got me to start working on my relationship with wanting a relationship. And I feel like I've had so many conversations with both of you about it after that, but that wouldn't even have happened if I didn't take that first step and be vulnerable with you guys.
That was so sweet. Thank you for sharing that. And I really mean it because like it's such a big part of yourself that
Yeah.
you worked to transform, and it's a live example of how it helped you cultivate that relationship of wanting a relationship. Like, I feel like being vulnerable with others, like, it helps you find things and learn things about yourself, and like you get to transform who you are like a million times over, and it's a very brave thing to do as well because it's scary being vulnerable, it's scary being honest and wondering if these people are going to listen to you or not. But so thank you. I'm really happy you shared that.
Yeah. It also made me think like I remember when that experience happened and I remember ugly crying with you. And just being so happy and proud to see like how you had shared that day. But I also do think that everybody in that space had been so vulnerable and we had been so like receptive to hearing each other's like stories and what they're feeling and all of that, right? So it kind of makes me like want to ask you guys, how do you know that when you get to that space of being that open and being that vulnerable, or even wanting to get to that space, how do you know that it'll be received well? And how do you know that like you'll get this amazing revelation out of it, like you did, Tika? Like, I think I don't have the answer to this because I think it's like, obviously like most of the effort is from us, right? Like I'd say 70% of the effort is us and then 30% is the environment too, right? Like what would have happened if you did share that way but it had been with a different group of friends, right? Like I'm curious to kind of explore like I don't know what that means. I don't know if that made sense.
No, I think it makes sense. I just don't think I've figured it out either, to be completely honest with you. Like, I think it's trial and error, and it's kind of shitty because, like, when you share or are vulnerable with like a different group of people or a different type of person that doesn't receive it, like it leaves you feeling really bad.
Yeah.
Like you're not walking away from that thinking like, "Oh, I was vulnerable, go me." Like no one's walking away from a situation like that, And so I think in the last few years I've had both um types of experiences where I've been vulnerable to people who have received it beautifully and I've been vulnerable to people who have not received it, and I think it it goes along the lines of what Tika was saying before about how if you accept that part of yourself, like you'll leave saying, okay, that was shitty, but like I'm holding that part of myself, so it's okay, you know? And if it's a part of yourself that you don't accept and you were trying to share it to accept it more, I think that it's just it's just gonna hurt, and it's a little bit of like a self-discovery and self-journey that you have to go on of like, okay, you know, maybe I was opening up to this person for them to accept me when really I have to accept that part of myself, you know? So I feel like you don't really lose in either situation. You learn something in both situations, but I just don't think it's not gonna hurt when you share with people that don't receive you.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the most honest answer we can give, right? It's not about, oh, every time you be vulnerable, it's going to be like sparks flying and you're going to discover all these incredible things about you. Like sometimes it's going to really suck, especially when it's not received the way that you were hoping that it would be received. But I do have faith that if we just keep practicing it, like the right people will come our way. I really do have faith in that. I have faith in energy and reciprocity. And I really do think that the more we cultivate being authentic and being vulnerable, the right people do come our way. So, and I think Aditi, like, yeah, you said like you had experiences where it didn't work out, but then you had some beautiful experiences where it did. And you were only able to like come back and be vulnerable with the right people because a part of you was like, I'm going to keep practicing this.
I also think your body has a way of knowing. Um, I feel like, sometimes like we've all been there where we're like, maybe we shouldn't share this. And then you share it, and then you're like, yep, I was right. I should not have shared it. And I feel like, and I think we should take those risks. I think that's really important to just, sometimes ignore your body, take the risks, see what happens. But I think, like, especially things that are so locked up in our hearts, I think your body can sense, like, I'm in an environment where it's a little bit scary, but I'm not preventing myself from saying it. I want to talk about it. I'm just a little scared. And I think that is so different than being blocked and you being like, oh my gosh, no, like, everyone's going to laugh at me if I talk about this. Like,
Yeah.
it's a different feeling, and you can almost like feel your heart protecting yourself. Um, I honestly feel like something I struggle with is like I feel like I have some friends that if I am vulnerable with them, it's not that they have a bad response, but it's not that they have a good response. They're just like, "Wow." you're like you're like, "Okay, and
Give me something.
like give me something, and you just like feel like it's incomplete. So it's not like they don't like accept it, or they don't have like they're like, I'm so good, like that's so great for you, and you're just like, okay, but like, do you have anything else to add on? So how do you guys deal with that?
That's a really good point. And it kind of goes into what I was thinking about before you share that, Tika, which is, um, you know, it's so like I feel like it's socially acceptable, right? Like as a woman to like be vulnerable and like create those spaces to be vulnerable. But like creating like having that environment where you feel like your body's response is okay, like I feel comfortable to share. I think it does come a little bit easier when you're a woman. And I feel a lot for the men out there, because what are they supposed to do, right? Like most of the environments that they're in, whether it be work, whether it's like when they're hanging out with their friends, it's not really to cultivate that vulnerable space. So yeah, when you were just talking about that, it made me think of this. And a lot of the time that's the response they get is like, cool, dude, you know?
Actually,
And then where do you go from
I hope you figure it out.
yeah,
yeah.
literally. And where do you go from there? And I think that's why so many men struggle with being vulnerable. Um, it just made me think like recently, my husband, one of his like best friends from college called him. He was going through a really tough time, and he just a lot of the times when he's going through something, he doesn't really reach out to people. He just internalizes it. And I think that's what a lot of men do, honestly. Maybe a lot of women, I don't want to classify, but he finally just called my husband and was like, yeah, I want to talk to you about this. And my husband was sharing with me later, he was like, I think that's one of the most vulnerable conversations we've had in our entire friendship. And they've been friends for like almost 10 years now, so it's really interesting to me because I think it's not so not even understood, it's not so socially acceptable for men to do this. And I think it's really really hard for them to find spaces to be vulnerable like that. And again, I don't want to classify it for just men. I'm sure both genders or all genders experience these issues as well. But it made me think more about those safe spaces that Aditi was talking about, like at the retreats and having more areas where the fundamental like point of that connection is to create a vulnerable space, right? Because right now I think people are just like searching for that and they don't have it. Like, what are you going to do? Go into work and talk about the game and then tell them about how you've been feeling depressed recently? Like, you know what I mean? It just doesn't get reciprocated. So like, I think that's something I'm reflecting more on. Like, that's the whole point of this podcast too, right? Is for us to like start creating those vulnerable spaces, because if we don't, like, this keeps happening where we just kind of feel like I want to share, I just don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Aditi.
No, I was just gonna say that I think one thing like where you're with good friends and you're trying to be vulnerable and like maybe you're not getting that response is just to like prod them a little bit, be like, well, what do you think? And like if they don't give you an answer, you're like, but what do you really think? Like just please, you know? Um and I think you can do that with good friends, I think it's a little bit harder to do it when you're making friends or you're like you have acquaintances, but like sometimes like if you want to know more about what somebody thinks, like you can just ask them, I think a lot of the times like the way we are personally, like we think that the other person is the same way. Like if I think so deeply into things that half the time I'm like, how can that person not be thinking this deeply into things?
Yeah.
But they're just not. They're literally just not. They're just vibing, and that's
Yeah.
totally fine.
Sometimes that's a good thing,
It
honestly.
is a good thing. No,
Yeah.
100%. Like I think that that's what like creates excitement in life, like different personalities. But what I'm saying is like if like sometimes you just need to ask and just be like, can we talk about this? Or what's your take on this? And then if they don't give you much, then it's kind of just like, all right, like maybe another day, or maybe this is just a topic of conversation with different people. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's so true. I was also gonna say for what you were talking about, Harini, um, is like with the men thing. I feel like it's also like it's up to that guys to take that first step, but I think it's also up to them to have like females in their life because I think that's where it starts, right? It's like you start becoming more vulnerable when you have this like care and empathy and this figure that will be able to, I don't know, facilitate that for you, but sometimes it gets really toxic and then you become like the therapist for that person, but like not in that aspect, but just like I feel like it's really important to initially have a woman you can talk to about it, and then when you have those conversations, you can have conversations with like your guy friends too, because like there are some things that you just can't talk to girls about or like they don't want to listen to.
I don't know. I don't know. I do think it's important for like men to have healthy female friendships, obviously, like, and I think it's important for women to have healthy male friendships, but I don't know that like the spark of vulnerability comes from those female relationships. And let's say it does, I don't know that it's transferred over so easily to male relationships because like that process of vulnerability, like, okay, now you have a woman in your life that like you could be vulnerable with, but that doesn't mean that like you're gonna feel comfortable doing it with your boys, you know what I mean? And I also think like, I don't know, like, and I know this isn't what you were saying, but it's like I just don't think that like it's a woman's job to do that. And I know
No,
that's
yeah,
yeah,
no,
yeah. I know that's not what you're saying. I know that like obviously like the premise of a friendship is like you're there for one another and just as vulnerable as that other person is, you are as well. You know what I mean? But I think what happens is like a lot of guys kind of just like put the girl into like the mom role. And then
yeah,
now it's not like you're cultivating vulnerability. Now it's like you're like taking care of this person. And so it's difficult as a woman, I guess, to like I guess there's a difference between being vulnerable with your female friends and being vulnerable with your male friends. You know what I mean? Like, I do think that there are so many different things you can learn from like each, but I feel like you also got me thinking of how my vulnerability is different in female friendships and in male friendships. So
And another point to add,
Yeah.
wow, it's kind of cool because I feel like this is the first time we've like kind of disagreed on something,
Yeah.
which is good. Because I
Wait,
think
but I also wasn't saying that females should
oh,
be males got moms.
No,
Like
I
I
know
said,
you
we know
weren't.
that's not what you're saying,
they
but
should be
it's a valid
therapists.
point. It is a valid point, but yeah, we know that's not what you're saying.
Yeah.
Um, it also made me think I have a lot of female friends where it's really tough for them to be vulnerable too. And I have some
Yeah.
male friends who are a little too vulnerable. You know what I mean? So I think it's like maybe it's seen as a feminine quality, but I do think yes, like men do struggle with this a little bit more, but I don't want to discount the fact that vulnerability is hard regardless of what gender you are. And sometimes what's so sad is I feel like women can be so judgmental of other women, where it can actually be more challenging to be vulnerable with a bunch of girls than it would be if you just had like a guy friend that you were like venting to, you know? So I think like that's also something to explore as well, is the fact that like, yeah, like we can all like have our issues with vulnerability and really feel like we're being judged and not in a safe space regardless of what gender you are.
Yeah, I think because vulnerability comes off as a feminine quality, women are expected to be vulnerable, and that's why I think it is harder for some women to be vulnerable because sometimes it's just not your personality, and sometimes you don't want to share, you don't want to talk to people about your problems, you don't want to dive into like your deepest traumas to connect, you know? And that is kind of what's expected of you, you know what I mean? To like be a person that receives that and also shares it, you know what I mean? So like yeah, I agree. I don't think that it's easy for women to be that vulnerable.
I think to your point also, Didi, that's kind of what Tika was saying, right? Like it comes from a space of having to accept those things about ourselves too. And then when we do, maybe it is a little bit more easier to share and be vulnerable about it. But I really do want to start shifting the mindset of vulnerability, not just being this like sweet, like feminine thing that helps you connect. Like it is a power. Like I see that at work too. The people that can like emotionally connect with others, those are the ones that make it far because they understand, like everything is relationship management, right? Like when you understand the intricacies of the people you're working with, the people that you're living with, the people that you like consider your friends, it is a power. I mean, not to say it in like a manipulative way, but like it helps you understand like this is how to connect with other people, and vulnerability taps into that empathy, it taps into that way of being able to like connect, and that is a huge skill set to have. And I think the more we're able to be vulnerable, we tap into that skill set, and it's what will like I generally think it's what makes people successful. I mean, there's a lot of like not vulnerable people that have become successful, but the type of success that we strive for, I think that's what makes the difference, honestly, is that emotional intelligence that comes from being vulnerable.
I feel like a topic we should also talk about that we don't have time here, but like something that came up for me is I guess like introverts versus extroverts when it comes to vulnerability,
Yeah.
especially in the workplace. So, yeah, maybe that's a topic for the future because that would be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's huge, and I think
Yeah.
that's a great thing to bring up because I think like that personality of being an introvert versus an extrovert plays into being vulnerable so
For sure. Like even when the three
100%.
of us were talking, me and Tika are extroverts. Aditi, you're an introvert. So we were saying like, oh, we've actually never really had an issue with being vulnerable. And you were like, really? I feel like it's not that easy for me.
So, a question that I was going to ask to wrap everything up is I feel like we have each other and we have our spiritual community. A lot of people don't have a community, or, sometimes it's really hard to have like really, really close friends too, where you can be vulnerable. So, I want to hear about a time in your guys' life where you have been vulnerable with a group of people that isn't associated with like a spiritual community, or it's not me and Harini and Aditi. And yeah, just how you felt, how it worked out. Yeah.
I can go. I think um like in like the end of last year I was going through finals and I was going through a little bit of a rough time and I was vulnerable with my law school friends, and not like about specific. I think that this is also a really cool thing about vulnerability is that like for me being vulnerable was just sharing like, hey, I'm not doing that great, rather than explaining why I wasn't doing great. And I was able to do that with my law school friends, and like they were there to lift me up. And it was really, really great because like I knew that I didn't have to explain anything. I could just tell them, like, I'm just feeling shitty and we have to get through these finals right now. Like, can I lean on you? And they so beautifully received me. And I feel like it made me feel closer to them. And I was able to like blossom those friendships even more.
I love that. I love that you made that point, Aditi, because it's so true. Vulnerability doesn't mean you have to overshare what's going on in your life. It can just be like expressing an emotion that you're feeling and somebody receiving that emotion. There's been so many times where haven't like told you guys the specifics, but just been like, hey, this is how I'm feeling, XYZ. So thank you for bringing that point up. I think it's like very, very important. For me, I actually think, this has been a little bit of a struggle because I've moved to a new city. So I'm like trying to make friends here. So I'm like, how much is too much if I share with you? Like, I want to get close to you, but like, I don't know where we're at yet. So, recently with like some of the people that I'm meeting here, I just started testing the waters a little bit. And I was just sharing some of the emotions I was feeling about, feeling like a little bit like isolated from my friends and my family, and some of the emotions I've been dealing with. That I shared that with somebody I met here, and then they actually started opening up about some of the things going on in their life too. And I've known, like, even though I've like just started getting close to this person, I've known them for a couple of years now, and it was probably the most honest conversation we've ever had, and it just came from me expressing, again, didn't really give the specifics. I was just kind of like, these are the emotions that I'm like dealing with right now. And they started sharing things with me that hasn't like that was not like where our friendship was before this conversation happened. So it's like a very like real life example of somebody that I feel a lot closer to now because we were both able to share more about what's going on in our lives. So yeah, that's something that I've been trying recently, but it's really hard for me, especially because I feel like I know I say it's so easy for me to be vulnerable, but I think it's because I have such a great like friend circle and family and stuff. And now like not being around that and like having to create that space again for me has been sort of a challenge. So I'm still struggling with it a little bit, but that was a really sweet example that worked out.
That's so cute. I think that reminded me of an example of it was like I was having like I was like feeling stressed about something. I was having these like really like weird annoying thoughts that were getting me down. And I remember I had dinner with one of my really close friends, but he's like one of my best friends, but we're not vulnerable with each other. We're just like laugh when we're together and it's a great time and he's still one of my best friends. But I decided that I was going to just share this part of myself with him because it was something that was honestly like in my head at the time we were at dinner. And when I expressed my concern and how I had been feeling, he expressed that he had been feeling the same way. And he was able to be vulnerable with me. And I feel like we were able to like hear each other out because we had similar experiences and then also kind of pacify each other too. So it was a really, really nice experience because sometimes, like, when you're best friends and you don't have that relationship, it's hard to carve it. Um, but it was nice to like break through a deeper layer. And I feel like we've both held on to that since.
I love that. And it just reminds me of the point that you need to be vulnerable in your friendships. I know we come off in this podcast as being so lovey dovey with each other, and we are, but like there have been challenges in our friendships too, individually and collectively. And it's so uncomfortable to talk about it. But that's also practicing vulnerability, right? Like with the people that you trust and love, talk about these things. Like, if something is upsetting you in a relationship or somebody's not meeting your expectations, talk about it. Because that's so important and it just cultivates that stronger friendship. And it really actually does bring you closer. So yeah, I mean, maybe we should share some of those experiences in a later episode, but yeah, I just remember that too.
And I think that's the best way to wrap it up.
Thank you all so much for joining us for another episode.